For the lab assignment, you're going to complete part one, and that has three exercises. You will be naming them Chapter 9, EX1, Private Access. In fact, I can show you here. Chapter 9, EX2, Public Access, and Chapter 9, EX3, Mixed Access. And the points that you're being awarded are based on difficulty. It's a lot more work to create a class with private fields than it is with public fields. So I do have examples for you to look at. So we've got the link here to programming example one, which was the one that was linked into the chapter, illustrating how to use private fields. And it's the second example that is similar to what you have to do. And there is a video. The video on the chapter includes an explanation of this exercise. And I will add a time slot here so that you can just forward and watch just the explanation of this particular program because you need to do something that's really similar. So you will be creating your own class with private access. You need at least 4 private fields. So the example that I'm having you guys look at has 3. You need 4. And you get to decide what those fields should be. So, and you have to have at least 4. That doesn't mean you can't make more. Okay, so you're creating a class, and if you're looking for ideas, I thought, well, movie reviews, game reviews, or a membership roster, those all may be good for a class. And then I included the data types, maybe what you could call things. And so, you guys could use one of those or, use whatever you are interested in. As far as the requirements, you need to create a default constructor and a parameterized constructor for your class. Because we are dealing with private fields, you need a get and set method for each field. You also need a print method that is part of the class that displays the class data. In the main method, you are going to create at least one object using the default constructor, and then you're going to have to use set methods to put data into the fields. You're going to print out the data from that object using the get methods. Then you're going to create at least one object using the parameterized constructor, and you are going to then use the class print method to print out that data. Anytime you retrieve input from the console, so if you decide to prompt the user and have them type it in, you do need to validate the data to make sure it is accurate. Okay, and then you will upload your code. So if you look at the example, okay, I've got everything I'm asking you to do, and this is the second example, including a print method. And here is where I use the default constructor, and here is where I use the parameterized constructor. Here are all the set methods. Here I'm using get methods with WriteLine, and here I am using print that is part of the class. That is what you have to do. Okay, and if you guys want to do anything additional, that is awesome, but these are the minimum requirements. For exercise 2, you are going to create public fields in the class. So instead of having 4 private fields, you're going to have 4 public fields. And if you want to, reuse the field in the class that you created for exercise 1, that's fine. If you wanted to, just do a brand new one, that's okay too. But what you need for this is 4 public fields. Now, your public fields should not begin with an underscore. They need to begin with a capital letter. And you should not have get and set methods. So if you're going to reuse what you did in exercise 1, you are going to have to change the names and remove the get and set methods. What you need is a default constructor and a parameterized constructor, and you need a print method. And that is what you need in this class. So you need the 4 public fields, you need the 2 constructors, and you need a print method. And anything else that you guys want to create is fine, but do not leave the get and set methods in there, and do not begin your public fields, the names, with an underscore, because the underscore is used for private. In the main method, you are going to end up creating 3 objects. And this is just like the example. So there is a separate video that goes through the example, and it's not the first one. It is the second one. So what you're going to do is just like this example. In fact, I will put a little link to the video, and the video includes the chapter information and all the examples. So I will indicate where the information for this particular example starts, what time you would need to forward to. So looking at the class, you have a requirement of 4 public fields, and this only shows 3, so you need to have a 4th. You'll have a default constructor and a parameterized constructor and a print method. Then in your main method, you are going to create 3 different objects. So one of them needs to call a static method to add data, and you're going to pass the class object. Okay, so here, object 1, you have to use a default constructor, need to create a static method that accepts a class object as an argument, and this method is going to add data. So you're going to be prompting the user, going to be validating what they entered, then you will be assigning the data to the public field. Okay, and so this is pretty much what you need to do. And then if you come down to add data, you'll see that it's prompting for each of those data for each of those public fields, but we're storing it in a string. We are declaring a variable that the validated data can, be output to. And then we have our validation loop. Okay, and once you get through the loop, you can do the assignment statement. And because these are public fields, we don't use set methods. So it's just the object dot and then the field name. And the object is actually coming in to this method as a parameter. So club is our class, serving as kind of our data type. And then this is what we are calling the object. Okay, so you are going to need to prompt for each of the fields. You have to validate those fields, and then you're going to store the value in the public field. Okay, so object 1 is using that add data method. Object 2, you're going to use the default constructor, and then instead of calling the add method, you can directly assign values to the fields. And so there's a lot of different ways you can do this, but here is probably the simplest way, and that is to create the object with the default constructor, and then hard code the values and do assignment statements. Okay, as far as printing them out, object 1, you have to call the print method. For object 2, you are going to be creating your own write line statement. And so again, this example is exactly what you need to follow, because here we are using the class print method, and here we have our own right line statement. Object 3, you're going to use the parameterized constructor. And because you're using the parameterized constructor, there really isn't any need to, call the add method or, uh, assign values because there's already values in your fields. So after you use the parameterized constructor, you can just call the print method to print them out. And that is what is being done here using the parameterized constructor. And here's where we're printing. That brings us to exercise 3. Exercise 3 is similar to this third example, but it is much simpler than the third example. So the third example has 3 public fields and it has 3 private fields. And one of the private fields is a list. And I'm not making you use any complex data types here. So what you need to do here is your class is going to have 2 public fields and 2 private fields. And it's a game class. And then for the validation rules, these are going to apply to the private fields. They are not going to apply to the public fields. And so private fields are going to they're going to need set and get methods. And in the set method, that is where you are going to check for validation. Okay, and I'm going to pause this because I'm going to show you what that should look like. So I'm just going to show you my code here. So for the release year, we said it could not be less than 1990. So this is a set method, so it doesn't return anything, and we're pulling in release year. And so basically, they're going to stay in this validation loop as long as they type a year that is less than or equal to 1990. First thing we display is that the year has to be greater than 1990. We're asking them to try again. We are reading in the year into like a temporary variable. And so then we have a little validation loop here where we are trying to convert this string into an integer. And if it can convert it, we are storing that integer in release year. If it can't convert it, we do the error message and we read that string year in again. So by the time we get out of this loop, we have release year. Oh, actually, by the time we get out of this loop, we actually don't go down there yet. We go back up here and it checks to make sure that, that it's not less than or equal to 1990. So if they still did an invalid year, we go through all of this again, but eventually they are going to do a year that is larger than 1990, in which case we come down to this line and we take the release year, we place that value into our private underscore release year. For cost, it's very similar. So the method is called set cost. We are bringing in a double value that I have named cost. And so what we need to check for, what we actually want is for the cost to be between 10 and greater than or equal to 10 and less than 200. It needs to be between 10 and 200. Okay. And so this is kind of what we want. So it's a problem if it is not that. Okay, so I put a not in front of this. And so, if the total cost is not, greater than or equal to 10 and it's not, less than 200, it's a problem. So then we write out the cost has to be between 10 and 200. So we're reading it into a string. We have our validation loop just to make sure that they're giving us a double value. And if they are giving us a double value, we store it in cast. Otherwise, we prompt them and they keep entering. So by the time we are done, it's going to be here, right after this loop. So it's going to come back up here and it's going to look at that range again. So, as long as they enter a number between 10 and 200, it's good. And it's not going to go through this loop. What'll happen is it falls to the next line and it puts the cost into underscore cost. So it's only actually going to go through here if the number is not between 10 and 200. So that you need to do something similar. Okay, and that's how we're going to validate. And so the implication for this is that anytime you are prompting for the year or the cost, you do need to make sure that the year is an integer and the cost is a double value, but you will not be checking for the rules because the rules are built into the class. Okay? And so what you need in your game class is a default constructor and a parameterized constructor. You need to have get and set methods only for release year and cost. And in those set methods, you need to have the validation rules that I just showed you. And then your game class is also going to have a print method. Okay, and then once you're done with the game class, you can either create the main method or come down here, you'll see that you're also going to be creating a menu and an add game method. So menu and add game are static. They will go below your main method. For menu, this is going to be, gosh, almost identical to the example where they are going to be able to add, print, or quit. And so you're going to validate the input to ensure that what they have entered is an A, P, or a Q. So first, you're going to check to make sure that they entered a character. And assuming they did, that value is going to be placed into choice. And then you're going to check, to see, I mean, if they entered an A, P, or a Q, then if it's asking if is the choice not equal to A? Well, if they entered an A, it is going to be equal to A. So that's going to, pop you out of the loop. So you're only going to get this prompt if it couldn't be converted into a character or they didn't enter an A, P, or Q. Okay, and so that's when you get the prompt. And then after you are done with the validation, you're going to convert the character the user enters into uppercase and return it to the main method. For the static add game method, and I think I'm going to pull up the example because some of these methods are identical to what you need to do in the example. So if we look at the example and we go below the main method, you will see that there is a menu method, and this is exactly what you need to do. Okay, identical. And then you'll also notice that there is an add method, and you are going to also need to create an add method. And for your add method, that's going to have a return data type of void because you are actually going to pass an array of game objects and a reference to the number of games that they have added. So we're going to let them create their array of game objects. They're going to select the size, and they might choose like 100. And this is going to keep track of how many they've actually entered. For the public fields, the data can be placed directly into the field. Do not use a set method. So basically, all you need to do is prompt the user to enter, in this case, it's going to be title. You're going to validate the title to make sure it's not null or empty. And then you can assign that value that you stored directly to the title. And so if you look at the example, we are dealing title is a public field, and it happens to be a string. So we do have some examples of public strings here. And so you're going to do something very similar to entering the type of creature. And also it is similar to entering the name of the creature. Pretty much identical. That is what you are going to be doing for both the title, okay, and the game platform, because they are both strings. So it is going to be almost identical to what you see here, okay? And then you have two private fields. So you still need to validate those, and they happen to be numeric. So you are going to prompt the user, read the input into a string, use try parse to make sure that you can convert it into integer if it's the year or double if it's the cost. And that is the only check that you are going to make. Because when you call the set method for the release year and you call the set method for the cost, the methods are going to do the validation checks. You do not need to duplicate that logic. So all you're going to validate for is that, yes, this is indeed an integer, or yes, this is indeed a double value. Okay, and so that is what this is showing you. Okay, and then once you call the set method is going to do some additional checks for you. Okay, and so if you want examples, now this example from our chapter, this does not have integer or double. We are dealing with Boolean and a list. But I think you can kind of, get the idea that you're going to have to read the value into a temporary string. If it's integer, you're going to have to declare an integer variable. And then assuming that, this will be int.tryparse, assuming that you can convert the value, it'll store it in whatever variable you defined as an integer. And then you don't have to do this as if else. You basically are just going to call the set method and pass this value that is output. Okay, and that's what you need to do for both the cost and the release year. In fact, just to avoid any confusion, I will show you what that actually looks like in your assignment. Okay, so here is handling private fields. Here is what is the year the game was released. We read it into a temp value string. And see here, I've got integer and it's temporary. Here is the validation loop. And if it can convert temp value into an integer, that is stored here. And then here's where I am calling set release year. Okay, so that is basically what you need to do in your add method. At the very bottom is where you're going to increment the counter that was passed. Okay, so you'll just add 1 to that, and then you're going to return to main. So we've talked about everything except for the main method. So let's take a look at what you need to do in main. So you need to create an array of game objects, and the user gets to decide how many games they want in the array. So, you're going to prompt them, how many games do you want? We are going to read the value in as a string. We are going to create a value, integer value called count. And we are going to make sure that whatever they entered can be converted into an integer. If it can, we store the number in count. If it can't, then we prompt them to enter a whole number and we read that in. Now, assuming it's converted into count, the only additional check we're going to make here is to make sure that the number isn't 0 or negative, because that would be a problem for us. We cannot create an array with a size of 0, and we can't create an array that has a negative size. Okay, so we're just making sure that number is bigger than 0. So once we validated the count, we actually create the game array. And if you remember from the lecture and from the programming 3 discussion, when you create an array of objects, C# does not instantiate each of the objects that are in the array. It just sets the array to null. And that is a problem because we can't call methods and access public fields with a null object. So after creating this array of objects, we need to instantiate each element. Each element in the array represents an object. So we do a little for loop. And the condition here is I less than count. Count being the number of elements that we have in our array. So we index in to our array and we call new game. And this is going to run it through the default game constructor. Okay, and that instantiates this object. So it's going to go through every single element and instantiate the object. After we do that, we are going to create a variable to store the number of games that have been added. Okay, it's going to be an integer. It doesn't matter what you name it, but you have to set it to 0. Okay, and at that point, we're going to call the menu method, and we are going to retrieve the value that the user enters. So the menu method needs to display the choices, needs to retrieve the choice, and it needs to validate the choice before it returns it. Okay, and so that is exactly what this example is doing. Okay, you can see up here is where we are creating the array of objects. Here's where we've got the counter. Here is where we instantiate each of those objects that are in the elements. And here is where we are calling menu. After you call menu, you are going to need a while loop. You're going to stay in the loop as long as they haven't chosen to quit. Then you can use either an if else or a switch. And you need to check to see if they entered an A or a P. If you are using a switch, they should never, ever get down to default. If they do, that's a huge problem because you validated that they entered an A, a P, or a Q. Okay, so that should never happen, but it is good practice to put the default in. If they select an A, you need to compare the games added to the count. And that is exactly what's happening here. So the games added are how many objects that they've filled in, and the count is the maximum. So as long as the number of objects that they filled in is less than the maximum, we can add another one. So we call the add method, we pass the array of objects, and we pass a reference to our counter. Now, what happens if they have already entered the maximum? Well, then it's going to pop down here to else, and it's just going to tell them that they've entered the maximum. We aren't going to end the program because they can still choose to print. Okay, so once we display that message, it's going to fall out of the switch and display the menu. As they can still print. So we're not actually going to exit out until they enter Q to quit. When they enter a P, first thing we need to do is check to see if they have added an object. Because sometimes people see a menu and they'll hit P and they haven't done anything else. So we check our counter to see if it's 0. And if it is, that means they haven't entered anything. So we tell them they have to add, in your case, it's going to be a game before they can print it. So, if the counter is not equal to 0, that means we actually have something. And so we go into the else, and we are going to do a little loop and print out the information for each of the game objects. So it's just a matter of initializing I, your index to 0. I is going to be we're going to continue incrementing I as long as it's less than the counter. In your case, it's going to be the game counter. And then this adds 1 to I. And then each time we go through, we are indexing in. You guys are going to be indexing into game, and you're going to be calling the print method that is part of the game class. Okay, so that is pretty much what you need to do. Okay, and we have gone through all of these instructions. Okay, and once you finish, make sure you test and correct any errors and then submit the program. If you guys have problems with any of the lab assignment programs, you are probably, I'm hoping that my Google Workspace is enabled soon. But while there are problems with my Google Workspace, you're going to have to use this inbox to send me a message. So you can actually copy and paste your code right into a message here. Although if you send it, yes, if you do it this way, it does go through my NMC email, but I will be coming in to check messages here, so I will see it. Okay. As long as there's a problem with my Google Workspace, I cannot access the NMC Gmail, but I can access this. Okay, so if you have a problem, you can still send me your code. Just make sure you use this. Okay. So please let me know if you have questions.